Today we're going to talk about a specific objection to Christianity. I'll put it on the screen for you. It's one of my favorite. It's that Christianity is anti-science. And the reason why this is one of my favorite objections is that this is one of the most popular barriers to faith that is offered by young ex-Christians as they leave the church. If you ask them, or even Christians who are in the church who are struggling, a lot of times the context of their struggle, the nature of their struggle is that they don't believe that what they've been taught about the world from a science perspective can be reconciled with what they've been taught about the world from the Bible. They think that the Bible and science are so diametrically opposed that there's no middle ground you can ever find. There's no way to reconcile these two differences. And they've formed the opinion that the Bible is, for some reason, anti-science. Now, the culture has also agreed with that. The culture also many times thinks that we are somehow anti-science, usually because we reject a naturalistic perspective of how things came to be. If you believe that they're just blind physical forces through evolution alone, just random chance mutations acted upon by the environment through a process of natural selection, you can work God out of the equation altogether. Most Christians do not embrace a godless form of evolution, and for that reason, a lot of people think that we are just anti-science. Any science that would point to a godless form of evolution, of course, we would reject. Well, we're not rejecting the science necessarily, but they might think we are. So I want to talk about 3 ways to respond to this claim that Christianity is by its very nature anti-science. We'll do the first one right away. I'm going to put it on the screen. Again, when I put these paragraphs on the screen, the idea is to give you the briefest. These are the fewest words I could probably say in this category. But, of course, if I'm talking to somebody, I'm going to explain a little more, and I want you to see how I do that by comparing to what's on the screen. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's the response number 1. Look, Christianity isn't anti-science, but I think it's fair to say that Christianity is anti-scientism, but I'm going to have to define that word for you, right? Here's what I mean when I say scientism. Scientism is the belief that science is the only way that you could ever know anything. That unless you can come to it by way of science, it's not even knowable or worth knowing. But I want you to stop and think about that for a minute. There's a ton of stuff that you and I know, right, without the benefit of any scientific endeavor at all. As a matter of fact, there are some things that science cannot tell us that we have to know before we can even do science. I'll give you an example of that. There are facts of logic, like the law of non-contradiction. There's not as though there's some kind of scientific experiment I can run to prove that law. I, in fact, have to embrace that law as true before I even start to do science. Even mathematical truths I have to embrace without the benefit of science in order for me to do science. So these things precede your scientific investigation. So you have to know them without the benefit of science. But not only that, there are tons of metaphysical truths. The kinds of truths, like, for example, that determine if the external world is real. Well, those are things we have to assume up front. We have to find those truths and get to those truths a different way before we can even do science. Even moral and ethical truths, right? The things that set boundaries for our behaviors. These things cannot be determined with science. Science can tell you what is, but it cannot tell you what ought to be. And aesthetic truths, like determining what is beautiful, what is repulsive, these are things that you cannot come to through some kind of scientific. Even historical truths often cannot be tested with any form of science. Now, you could say that maybe you could use forensic sciences in some cases. You could, but not in every case. So even historical truths we come to without the benefit of scientific endeavors. Look, Christians believe that science can tell us all kinds of important things. I'm with you on that. But we don't believe it can tell us all important things. How could science possibly, for example, tell us anything meaningful about the historicity of Jesus or the historical reliability of the Bible? We're going to have to get to those some other way. And that's why we don't believe, we're not anti-science, we actually like science, but we are anti-scientism. We know that there are more, we can use something other than science to get to a lot of truth claims that we believe are important to know. Okay, in this first response, all we're trying to suggest is that even people who would say that science is the only way to know something believe a lot of things that they didn't get to by way of science. So that's a self-contradictory statement. It's self-refuting. Look at it this way. If you said, I can only trust those things that I learn by way of science, well, you've already made a self-refuting statement, because that claim that the only things you can trust are the things you can demonstrate with science cannot be demonstrated with science to be true. That's a philosophical statement that you have to embrace before you do science. So already I could say to you, well, I know at least one thing that you believe is true without the benefit of a scientific process, and that is the idea that you can only trust what you can find by way of a scientific process. That claim is itself purely philosophical. It is not scientific. So I think we have to help people see that by their very nature, some things they already embrace. They already are in our camp for a lot of things. Help them to see that. Let's take a break. When we come back, I'm going to give you another way to respond to this notion, this claim that Christianity is somehow anti-science. If you're like me, I bet you sometimes feel bad that you don't share what you believe as a Christian as much as you'd like. Sometimes it's because we're not well equipped. When I ask people why they don't share, some of these folks have even gone through, some of us have all taken classes in evangelism. I know I did as a new believer. You probably did too. Yet we still don't find ourselves sharing like we should, right? It turns out if you ask people, why don't you share even though you've been trained to do so, it usually comes down to some sense of fear. That I'm going to be caught flat-footed. I'm not quite sure what I would say if they ask a question. I don't want to look stupid. I hear these kinds of responses all the time when it comes to why people won't share what they believe as Christians. And I get that. I certainly have been there. That's why it's important for us to begin a process of training to get ready to make the case for what we believe. You'll be surprised at how much it'll help you and encourage you to actually start to make the case. I started by just mastering a simple idea. I believe, as a police officer, that there are objective, transcendent moral truths, and that these truths are obligations between persons. I think you have to have certain justifications before you can do certain things. Where do those ideas come from? Am I the source of those? Well, if that's the case, then if you disagree with me, there's nobody to arbitrate between us. So clearly those moral truths can't come from individuals. Do they come from people groups? Well, if that's the case, we can't argue if a different people group has a different set of moral truth claims. No, there's got to be something bigger than people groups. Is it nations? Well, if that's the case, why would we say that what Germany was doing in World War II was wrong? It can't be wrong. If the nation itself gets to decide if it's right, there's something that even transcends nations. If there's a Star Trek universe, there's something that transcends planets. There are some things you shouldn't do to Klingons or Romulans. Now, don't think about that for a second. If there's a source of moral law that transcends the entire universe, and if we know that all moral truth claims are actually obligations between persons, who is the objective, transcendent, moral person that is the source of the laws in the universe? When I started to think about that and kind of practice that in my head, it started to be something I would talk about with my friends who weren't believers. There's a set of disciplines that I can teach you that detectives actually use every day to investigate truth claims and then communicate them to juries that I think will help you be a better evangelist, a better Christian casemaker, to live a more robust Christian life that'll move you from a blind faith to a forensic faith. After I wrote a book called God's Crime Scene, I started speaking on these topics. Now, I've learned something a long time ago that if you write a book, before you start speaking about that topic, after you've spoken on the topic for a year or two, you're going to wish you could rewrite the book, because your talks reveal all kinds of better ways to communicate the issue. So my books usually are things I'm writing about after I've spoken on these issues for years, because I've kind of worked out the notions, especially if you're doing college presentations, right, where you're at universities, because you're going to have a Q&A session at the end of that, and then students are going to come up and say, well, yeah, what about this? What about that? And then you start to refine your thinking, refine your communication on how you would talk about these things, because you've already encountered all the different forms of pushback you're going to receive. So I wrote God's Crime Scene after I'd been speaking on a number of these topics for years. But afterwards, as I spoke more and more on several of the chapters from God's Crime Scene, by the way, God's Crime Scene is simply a way of looking at the universe as though it's a crime scene and asking the question, can I explain everything that's in the crime scene with a cause that is purely naturalistic? It's a simple idea. Can I explain everything in the room of a death scene by staying in the room? If I can, it's not a murder. If he's by himself in the room and it's a gunshot wound, but it's his gun, there's only one gunshot wound that he could account for himself. It's probably a suicide. If on the other hand, that's not his gun and I've got bloody footprints leading out of the room, now the cause of what's in the room is better explained outside the room. Now I've got a murder. Now ask yourself the question, can you explain everything that's in the room of the universe by staying in the room? If so, you've got to use space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry. If you can't stay in the room with just those things, space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, if you have to go outside of space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry, you're now into something extra natural. If the best explanation for the stuff in the room of the universe is a cause outside the room of the universe, what's that? And I think we got evidence for God. So as I look at this, it's really about trying to figure out what is the most reasonable inference from evidence. As I started talking about that, I realized that the difference between the way we're doing science today and the way we did science 200 years ago, one key shift has taken place. This next response to the objection that Christianity is anti-science, it really capitalizes on that shift. So let's go ahead and give you the response, and then I'll describe why it's so different. Here we go. Okay, Christianity, I don't believe it is anti-science. I think we can demonstrate that Christianity is not anti-science. In fact, some of the most famous scientists in the history of science, okay, were in fact believers, Christians. Johannes Kepler, René Descartes, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Max Planck. These are all folks who were believers, and they were still doing science. They did not believe that there was it was irreconcilable, that there was no way to reconcile their Christian beliefs with their scientific endeavors. Now you might argue, well, yeah, but Jim, those are all people who are pre-enlightenment. You know, once we realized there was no God, there's nobody left out here now who's doing science who believes in God. Actually, there are. There are a lot of current, accomplished, noted, peer-reviewed scientists who are still Christ followers. John Polkinghorne, Francis Collins, Michael Behe. These are people who are scientists who aren't afraid to overcome the shift. Here's what I mean by the shift. These scientists aren't afraid to ask all the classic investigative questions. The what question, the when question, where, how, why, and guess what? The last one, the who question. Many modern scientists really have shifted away from asking all of those questions. They now refuse to ask the who question. They'll ask all the others, but they will not ask a who question. Even when, by the way, the best scientific evidence, even when the facts, the results of their studies, the results of their experiments really best are explained by a who, they will never ask a who question. They will simply say, well, it can't be a who, so they'll default to a what. They refuse to ask that who question. Even when they find like evidence of information in DNA, which historically, there's never been a time in the history of science or the history of the universe in which information did not come from intelligence. If there is, point me to it, because you will not find that you can get information from physics, from the laws of physics, from space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry will not give you information. Information comes from free agency, from mind, from intelligence. But even when it points to that, okay, it points to an intelligent who, they still won't ask the who question. They refuse to even acknowledge the possibility of a divine who. Look, Christianity isn't opposed to science, just to scientists who refuse to ask all the questions. Why wouldn't it, by the way, why wouldn't scientists be willing to ask the who question? Now you'll see here what we're trying to do in all of these responses, these quick shot responses, is give you questions that you can ask in return, right? So you'll see that all of our responses in these categories usually end with us asking a question that we hope that our questioner will consider. And the shift that I think has happened here, and I kind of realized it as I was doing these talks around the country, is that yes, we are willing. Every investigation involves those classic questions. That's true also of homicide investigations, but I say it all the time. If I did a homicide investigation, I asked the what, when, why, where, and how questions, but I refuse to ask a who question, no one goes to jail. In the end, I have to be willing to ask the who question. Who did it? I can know everything there is to know about what happened, when it happened, where it happened, how it happened, why it happened, but until I ask who did it, no one goes to jail. Same thing happens here. Why? Look, in the end, when people were still willing to ask the who question, those Christian scientists who were happen to be Christian, believed that what they were examining was the way in which God interacts in the world. The way in which God acts in the world was discovered with science. But now we've simply removed the who. We're trying to figure out how forces alone can accomplish all of these things. Scientists who ask the who question are not going to jump to a who if a what is more appropriate. But when they've got evidence of a who, they allow themselves to ask the who question. You could still do science, and I think a much fairer, much more robust version of science, because you're going to ask the one question all those folks won't ask anymore. It's a who question, and science can help you to discover who the who is. So the third response I'm going to offer today really stands on the shoulders of that kind of thinking. All right, so let's get after it. I'll put it on the screen for you. I don't think that science and Christianity are at odds with one another at all. In fact, I would argue that science can help us make a case for the God of the Bible. Here's what I mean. Look, science tells us, science now, that everything in the universe came into existence from nothing. That's right. In other words, all space, time, and matter leapt into existence from nothing. You mean there was a void in which the universe... No. The void is space. That's something. That's not nothing. The science argues that everything in the universe, all space, time, and matter, came into existence from nothing. What's nothing, Jim? Well, it's what Aristotle said rocks think about. Nothing. That's what was... It's from nothing that the entire universe leapt. In other words, what that means is that all space, time, and matter came into existence and was caused by something that could not be itself spatial, temporal, or material, right? Because that stuff didn't exist. It wasn't available. It cannot create itself. Wait a minute. So you're telling me that all of this was created by something powerful, that's non-spatial, that's non-temporal, and non-material. Okay. Well, guess what? Science also tells us that our DNA, your genetic code, contains information, genetic information. And we know from science that you can't get that kind of information from physics and chemistry. Now, you might be able to get low levels of information, but the information in the genome is the highest level of information if you know anything about information theory. It contains true information. And the best inference for any information is an intelligent mind. It has always been. Every experience we have, every practical experience we have, of when we encounter information in the universe, it has come from a mind, from intelligence. The God of the Bible, okay, I think therefore is a reasonable candidate for the non-spatial, all-powerful, right? Non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, intelligent mind that could explain the scientific data. Now, I've only, by the way, covered 2 of what I think are 8 lines of scientific data. That's what I talk about in God's crime scene. But my point is, why do you think that some people reject the existence of God when the scientific evidence is most reasonably explained by God? We talk about this all the time, right? Facts and inferences. There are facts that we present a jury, and then they get to infer from those facts a verdict. We have facts in the universe. We have a universe that came into existence from nothing, that appears to be fine-tuned for the existence of life. Life that emerges from non-life on the basis of DNA that contains information. And the biology that eventually results from that appears to be designed. And everyone knows it appears to be designed. Even atheists like Richard Dawkins agree that biology is the study of those things that appear to have been designed for a purpose. Okay? We have to explain our conscious mind in the midst of a purely physical universe governed by physical laws. How is it you have a non-physical mind that's not governed by physical laws? And you have free agency, so that your choices are truly yours. And we believe there are objective, transcendent, moral truths that govern all of us, whether we like them or not. People can disagree about these, but there's an overarching moral truth that transcends us. And finally, we believe there's a standard of righteousness that is also so transcendent that when we see it broken, we call that evil. It's not a matter of personal opinion. We believe some things are transcendently evil. Well, what is the transcendent moral standard by which we are governing things and calling them evil? Look, there are lots of lines of evidence we could chase. But if you do that, you're going to have to figure out what cause, and can you stay inside the room? Is it just space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry? Good luck with that. As a matter of fact, most times when I talk about this, the other side will say, well, yeah, you're right. Science hasn't got an answer for those 8 things yet, but it will someday. Well, I'm asking you to render a verdict today. We don't allow jurors to say, well, based on the evidence you showed me in this trial, oh man, he looks guilty. But in the next 5 years, new evidence could surface. Okay, we'll do a retrial. We're asking you to render a verdict today based on what you know today. And based on what's available to us today, the most reasonable inference for those 8 things is the existence of an all-powerful, non-spatial, non-temporal, non-material, intelligent mind who accounts for DNA as the fine-tuner of both the universe and of biology, that is a mind that acts freely to create other minds that can act freely in his image, and that is the source for all transcendent moral truths, and even the source for a standard of righteousness by which we call something evil. That's the kind of suspect we're looking for. That suspect, by the way, we get that from the data, from the science that we do to determine the nature of the universe. Now we ask ourselves a question, what is the best explanation for that? For the data we got through science. Science is not at odds with Christianity. Science is the friend of Christianity, like we did for many, many generations before the Enlightenment. We simply ask a who question and we get the best answer. I hope these 3 ways of answering this objection that science is somehow at odds with Christianity will be helpful for you to get past this barrier so you can get the roadblock down, get the wall down so you can get to the gospel. By the way, this is not the gospel. This is not what Jesus came to do. This is the barrier that stands between your friends and the gospel, that stood between me and the gospel. Let's take that down so we can get to the gospel. And I hope that helps you, and we'll join you right back here for another one of these next week at Cold Case Christianity.